Today, we're not going to be working on this rust-free, relatively low-mileage 1989 Chevy S10. Nope, even though I need this truck on the road yesterday, well, we ain't going to be fooling with it. Instead, we'll be putting dual carburetors on this 670cc Predator-powered 1969 Renault R10. So for the folks that are new to the channel, this is a 1969 French-built Renault that we rescued last year. Unfortunately, the original engine was NFG, or as some folks would say, FUBAR. So, in order to reanimate this lifeless hulk, we went ahead and installed a 670cc Predator V-twin engine, which is not an unreasonable thing to do. As it turns out, this little V-twin is a good match for this beautiful little car. Here, let's take a look at the engine bay. So, as you can see under the hood of this car, there is no engine. But I promise you, this car has an engine. We just need to look a little harder. After all, it is French, and they put the engine in the trunk. So it's true, this car is powered by an engine from Harbor Freight, and I reckon we've put a few thousand miles on it already, with interesting results. Anyway, I have to say that a slightly modified original 2-barrel carburetor is likely the best option for this engine, and since we rejetted the carburetor to work with the custom exhaust, well, performance is actually fairly good, all things considered. But I feel like I need more challenges in my life, so let's go ahead and replace the perfectly good carburetor with a set of aftermarket carburetors. These carburetors come in a kit that's offered by Performance Machine and Design. So full disclaimer, they're not a sponsor, and I just wanted to give them a shout out because they offer unique parts for the 670 engine. Anyway, these carburetors are 24mm OCO PWKs, which is a clone of a Kia PWK carburetor. Now, OCOs are actually considered to be very good clones, and they're so good, well, some shifty entrepreneurs actually sell knockoffs of the OCOs. So technically that would be a knockoff of a knockoff, or something like that. Anyway, genuine OCOs are good stuff from what I've heard. So this kit did come with extra jets, and it'll be interesting to see if we'll need them once we get the 670 running on these carburetors. Now for the bad news. There's absolutely no instructions on how to make these carburetors work, and that kind of makes sense. You see, if you don't know what you're doing, then you shouldn't be fooling around with this stuff. However, if you do have a clue, then instructions really aren't necessary. Meh, I make YouTube videos, and if nothing else, I can edit my way through this mess. Oh yeah, now last summer we fooled around with this 36mm Kia CVK carburetor with excellent results as far as wide open performance goes, but I really couldn't tune this guy for an acceptable air-fuel mixture at idle and at part throttle. So I give up on the CVK type carbs. Perhaps when I get bored of the twin carbs, I'll try a giant flat-side Mikuni. Alright, well, let's look at the engine for a few moments before we dig into it. First of all, this engine's equipped with a dinky little alternator, and that's good in case you're wondering. Now, when we installed this alternator, we mounted it as low as possible because we knew we would eventually be installing the dual carburetors. Theoretically, there shouldn't be any clearance issues, and we'll find out soon enough. Now, this engine also has a K-type thermocouple probe on each of the exhaust ports. Well, that one's missing right now, but I do have one. Anyway, with the thermocouple probes and the wideband sensor, we're going to try our best to tune these carburetors for maximum performance and try to keep the air-fuel ratio in the zone that works best for an air-cooled engine. Now, this engine hasn't been run in a while, so let's fire it up to confirm it still runs. Yeah, I know, we should play with this car more often. Alright, it runs. These Predator engines are actually pretty good with the exception of the fuel pump that comes with them. Now we're running an electric pulse type pump with a fuel pressure regulator and a bypass with a return line because most small engine carburetors really can't handle much fuel pressure. I'll draw a cartoon of how all that works later in the video. The only problem I'm noticing is the idle seems a little bit high, and that causes a lot of problems putting the transmission into gear. Now, setting the idle on this engine is not as easy as you may think. We like to set the idle as low as possible, but if it's too low, the compression relief mechanism will kick in and the engine will stall. Alright, well, the engine definitely runs. Let's see how it runs with the twin carburetors. So this car has a lot of sharp edges on it, and it can draw blood a lot easier than you think. I reckon most of the engine bay could be considered a biohazard by today's standards. So I'm going to be wearing my Kevlar because I really don't need any scars, stitches, or bruises. So previously, I mentioned we're going to be using thermocouple probes and a wideband air fuel sensor to tune the carburetors. This sort of advanced tuning is rarely done on simple engines like this one. Generally, lawnmower and motorcycle engines are tuned by ear and throttle response. I reckon I could tune this engine that way, but I actually care about the air-fuel ratio. Now, it's possible we'll have to make some compromises along the way because, well, this is not fuel injection and we can't solve all our problems with a laptop computer. It'll be interesting to see how close we can get with the instruments we do have. Now, if you watched any of my previous videos where we fool around with diesel engines, well, this is not a diesel engine and the rules are vastly different. Oh yeah, to make things more confusing, this is an air-cooled engine, so the stuff in the textbooks that pertain to liquid-cooled engines don't necessarily work on air-cooled engines. The air-cooled VW folks know what I'm talking about. I reckon a fella could tune an air-cooled Volkswagen engine by ear and it would run perfect. But when you put a set of gauges on it, well, the air-fuel ratio would be way off what is considered normal. It gets even more complicated when you have 50,000 people giving advice based on liquid-cooled engines. I think with the tools that we do have, we can get this engine to run with an air-fuel ratio that is considered somewhat normal. And you never know, this kit may actually come with decent jets and the tune might be spot on. We'll find out soon enough. Okay, well, that should be enough stuff removed so we can install the twin carburetors. Now, it looks like the intake gaskets are still in perfect condition, so we'll leave those in place, but it looks like we'll have to remove the manifold studs because this kit comes with different fasteners. Removing these studs is actually simple, and we're going to use the jam nut method. I guess it's possible to use vice grips to remove these studs, but doing that will damage the studs. Now, here in the States, metric fasteners like these are good to put in your stash of metric stuff, because something like this would cost a few bucks each, if you can even find them locally. You know, the United States officially converted to the metric system in 1975, but you still can't get metric stuff here at a reasonable price. It's probably going to take another 30 or 40 years for us to think about possibly trying to understand the metric system, and I'm okay with that. Fast forward a few minutes and the intake manifolds are installed. It appears that there is a right and a left manifold, and you have to match each manifold to the intake port on the engine because the manifolds are not marked. Alright, well, we have to cut the holes in the plastic engine cover next, and as you can see, the area that needs to be cut is, well, somewhat awkward. So I 3D printed a set of doohickeys that can be installed in the intake manifolds so we know where to drill the holes. Now this is an awesome idea, but it's pretty much pointless because the holes need to be a lot bigger than the manifolds, and there's plenty of room to make mistakes. As a matter of fact, the time I wasted designing and printing these doohickeys could have been better suited just guessing on the location of the holes. You live, you learn. Okay, fast forward a few days, and I've worked out all the problems. Let's take a look. Yep, I wish it was that easy. Anyway, I ended up having to make a few things because the space I have to work with is limited. First of all, the holes in the cover are massive because I also need to have clearance for the rubber boots that connect the carburetors to the manifold. And I also have to have clearance for the clamps and yada yada yada. Now, that was actually easy to do, and while I was poking around, I discovered I would also need a hole for the crankcase ventilation system. Now, over here, I went ahead and custom built a special bracket for the throttle cable. Now, this bracket really isn't necessary unless you're doing a dual carburetor installation on a 670cc Predator engine in a 1969 Renault. You see, the throttle cable that was provided in the kit is almost a perfect fit to the existing throttle linkage in the Renault. So I built this bracket to keep everything in alignment. Now, since this bracket spans between both cylinder heads, I put a pivot point to accommodate any expansion the engine may go through as it warms up. It's hard to say if this is necessary, but the engine castings are remarkably thin, and if this bracket was solid, well, it may actually warp the engine. Now over here, I had to modify the engine cooling tins by adding some extra metal. This sheet metal extension is necessary because once I remove the stock intake manifold, there's a huge open space in the cooling system. This extension should help restore the airflow to the cylinder heads. So the air filters that were provided in the kit are actually really good ones. However, there was a slight interference with the rear panel on the car, so I had to improvise and use ABS elbows to get the necessary clearance. This may not be an ideal solution, but for now it'll allow us to run the engine on the wide open roads. I think that's about it. Let's put this thing together. So this is an extension hose that will use to vent the crankcase outside the engine enclosure. For now, I'm going to leave this vent open, but later on I may connect it to a road draft tube or just plumb it into the intake system. I think we need to get the engine running first before I start worrying about all the little details. The cooling tins go on next. Now, the extension part was designed using CAD. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Cardboard aided design. It was fairly easy to sort out with the cardboard, and converting it to tin was even easier. The throttle cable bracket is next, and as you can see, this heavy-duty bracket is anchored to the cylinder head on each side of the engine. If the engine expands while it warms up, this pivot point will flex and allow the expansion to occur without putting any stress on the engine case. I don't know if this is necessary, but it can't hurt. And now we can slip the engine cover on. This is a bit tricky because of the cooling tin extensions, but it does fit. And finally, we can install the carburetors. For our first start, we're going to be running the jets that came with the carburetors. It would be nice if this kit came with the right jets pre-installed. And now I can install the throttle cables. Like I mentioned earlier, this throttle cable is nearly perfect fit for a 1969 Renault with a Harbor Freight 670cc V-twin engine. But if this cable was a few inches longer, I probably wouldn't need this bracket. You see, this bracket just keeps the cable centered when I route the other end to the throttle linkage in the Renault. A couple of zip ties to hold everything in place for a nice fit. Now, this engine has had its governor completely removed, and this governor linkage isn't connected to anything inside the engine. I'm going to leave this in place for now in case I need it in the future. And finally, I can install the fuel lines for both carburetors. The fuel circuit on this car looks like this. The fuel pump that comes with the 670 engine is just pure junk, and we ended up having to use an electric fuel pump. Now, unfortunately, for most small engine carburetors, well, they can't handle the extremely low pressure of a crappy electric fuel pump, and the little pressure regulators that are available don't always work. So what we did was put a T in the supply line, and that gave the fuel a path back to the fuel tank. Now, right here is one of those crappy little fuel pressure regulators, and it's set to its lowest pressure setting. I don't think this thing actually works, and all it's really doing is providing a small amount of restriction in the fuel line. I reckon anything that restricts the fuel line a little bit would work fine. Anyway, the electric fuel pump will send most of the fuel back to the tank, and the rest of the fuel will keep the carburetor bowls filled. It's not rocket science, but this system seems to work on all the carburetors we've tested so far without overpressurizing the carburetor, and we've never had any fuel starvation issues. Now, for some folks, this makes total sense because this is how a fuel system is set up on most cars. But keep in mind, the carburetor on most small engines are generally made to handle gravity-fed fuel pressure, and they'll leak profusely if they see any pressure at the float needle and seat. Anyway, since this video pertains to the 670 Predator engine, I thought I'd add this diagram for anybody who may be having trouble with their stock fuel pump. Now, when we added the two carburetors, all we did was put a T in the line so we could feed both carburetors. It's simple, and based on past experience, it should work fine. Well, let's find out right now and pressurize the fuel system. So this is the master switch, and this is the ignition switch, and this is the fuel pump switch. Oh yeah, now you can hear the little fuel pump chooching. So far, so good. Now, just for giggles, let's see if the engine will run. I have the ignition system on and the Lone Wolf 2000s connected. Bring the thunder? Okay, as you can see, I was not expecting that, and I'm having a bit of a panic attack. Well, it runs, and it runs pretty good. The idle is way too high, and I want to see if there's any adjustment that can be made. Now, I'm doing this by ear, but I do have the tools to synchronize the carburetors. The problem is, on these carbs and the intake manifolds, there's no nipples on them to connect the synchronizers, so I'll deal with that later. So this car has its original 4-speed transmission, and in order to connect the engine to the transmission, we're using a CVT type clutch. With the idle this high, the clutch is going to be partially engaged, and it will be impossible to put the transmission in gear. Now, it does seem like there's plenty of idle adjustment left, so we should be able to get the engine to settle down a little bit. Fast forward a bit, and I've got the idle as low as it will go without the compression release kicking in. The CVT belt is still spinning a little bit, but it should be fine. At idle, the thermocouple probes are showing a difference in exhaust gas temperatures, but I'm not going to worry about that too much. It took a lot of adjusting of the idle mixture to get them this close, and it's close enough for now. Now, the wideband sensor is saying that the air-fuel ratio is in the mid to high 10s, which seems a bit rich for an air-cooled engine. I'd like to see it closer to the high 12s or low 13s, but this is all we can get from the carburetors right now. Let's see what happens when I goose the throttle. Not bad at all. It's still a little bit rich, but I think we can definitely take the car out for a test ride. Now, keep in mind, this is an air-cooled engine, and it wants to run rich. I reckon if we go above 14, we'll actually start losing some power, and we don't want to do that. Okay, fast forward a few minutes, and I pulled one of the carburetors out to see what kind of jets are in it. The pilot jet is a .38, and the main jet is a 105. For the pilot, I think we could probably go with perhaps a .35 or a .32. Now, those jets are available, but I don't have any in stock right now. So I went ahead and ordered a bunch of jets for both carburetors. I think for today, we'll run with what we got and see how the car performs. Now, off camera, I did spend a lot of time balancing the carburetors with the thermocouple probes and watching the air fuel meter. So this tune is good, but it's far from perfect. I know that, but I think a lot of folks want to see this little French car boogie down the road, so let's go ahead and do that. And after we finish with the road test, we'll try an experiment on this engine. So go ahead and grab some more Captain Crunch and refill your coffee. We're going on a ride. Okay, it's the next day and we have some pretty good weather today. It's in the low 90s and the roads are dry. Unfortunately, it's midday and the lighting isn't really good for filming. Out back, all the loose wires have been tucked away and the air filters are installed, but they aren't oiled yet. I'll do that later when it doesn't matter. So far, our single point inspection checks out and it looks like we're clear for departure on runway 36. Oh, let me do one more check and make sure we have enough gas. Yeah, that's probably enough. This car gets 35 miles to the gallon, and it looks like we have at least a gallon, so that's plenty of fuel. Alright, well, let's assume everything else on this 55-year-old French car is in top shape, because why wouldn't it be? Oh, today our primary goal is of course to test the carburetors, but we're also going to be testing a different camera mount system. You know, we've made some major changes to this car, but at no point have we altered or damaged anything in any way as far as the original car goes. So mounting the cameras in this pig has always been a problem. This is our current mounting system, and we're using zip ties and suction cups on the windows and a huge magnet on the floor to hold everything in place. You know, at some point in the future, this car will have a new owner. Perhaps they'll restore the car or use it for parts. Who knows? But the main thing is, when this car is in our possession, we'll do no harm to it. And that's why it's difficult to mount the cameras inside the car, and it's been a constant struggle because of all the vibrations. Anyway, let's roll. So reverse is still not working, but we can reverse the car using alternative methods, as you can plainly see. Maybe someday we'll have another look at the transmission linkage, but not today. Okay, let's check them tires. These are very expensive tires, and they cost more than the tires on my old Cadillac. Meh, they seem to have enough air, which is great because we don't have a spare. For some reason, the French like making four-door cars. This thing would be a lot cooler if it was a two-door, but that's my opinion, and you're welcome to have your own while it's still legal to have an opinion. So this car has a 4-speed manual transmission, as it should, but it also has a CVT drive between the engine and the original transmission. So basically, now it has a 2-speed semi-automatic transmission, and putting the gearbox in third gear allows us to drive around town like the car has an automatic. Some of the viewers hate this arrangement and some love it, but keep in mind this is an 1,800-pound car with a 25 horsepower engine, and the CVT really helps get this car moving. I'll shut up and let you guys listen to the glorious 2-cylinder engine sing. So in third gear, the car can accelerate up to 55 miles per hour, which is plenty fast for this thing. If for some reason you wanted to go faster, fourth gear will get you there. Now I have no idea how fast this car will actually go because it gets scary above 62 miles per hour. But I reckon it may max out close to 70. So as far as the carburetors go, well, it's hard to say. The engine runs really well and the throttle response is crisp. Now, judging from the sound of the CVT drive, we may actually be making some more power, which is nice. You folks can't see the air-fuel ratio gauge, but it's saying we're in the mid to high 12s, which is about right. I actually think that the jets that came with this carburetor kit are a perfect match for a baseline tune, but we will definitely do some tuning. I would really like to get the idle mixture slightly leaner just to see if I can, but in theory this car doesn't spend a lot of time idling. Now at part throttle, we're still seeing reasonable mixtures, and that's good too. Also at part throttle, the thermocouples are showing a 250-degree difference between the cylinders. That's interesting, and I'll have to look into that. Okay, well let's try something different and put the transmission into fourth gear and see how the car likes that. That's interesting. The engine pulls really nice in fourth from a standing stop. Keep in mind, I'm not giving it much throttle, just enough to get the car moving. So the CVT clutch and the belt are relatively new, as we had to replace them last summer. I can't imagine taking off in fourth gear is a great thing to do, especially for the belt, but it seems to work fine. Now, for a silly car like this that has no real purpose, the CVT is fine and it's easy to work on. Now, when it comes to a real car, I'm not a big fan of CVTs. Actually, I'm not a big fan of automatic transmissions, and I've pretty much always bought cars with manual transmissions. As a matter of fact, my last Cadillac had a 6-speed manual. Anyway, on this car, the hodgepodge semi-automatic transmission contraption that I made suits it well, and I think the French people would approve. In theory, I made a weird car even weirder, and that's totally French. Let's try doing a third to fourth shift at low speed. Yeah, that feels natural, and it's disturbing. Okay, well that went well, and I have some work to do, but overall the car seemed fine. Now let's try an experiment. So the idle speed on this engine can't go below 950 RPM. Well, it can, but once you go below 950 RPM, the compression relief gizmo kicks in and the idle gets choppy, and the engine will eventually stall. Here, let me show you. Now listen to the engine and you can hear it stumble. That's the compression relief kicking in. So removing the compression relief is a big little job. The engine has to come out and the case has to be split. It sounds hard, but in reality it should take less than 2 hours to do the complete job, and that's with plenty of coffee breaks. The problem is, will this engine actually start with the compression relief gizmo removed? Well, perhaps we should find out. So the compression relief thingy is attached to the camshaft, and at cranking speeds it'll bump the exhaust valve open to release compression until the engine starts spinning fast enough. My experiment is to increase the lash on the exhaust valves so the gizmo doesn't work correctly and the engine will have full compression when the starter is engaged. If we can get the engine to crank with the compression relief temporarily disabled, then it may be worth digging into the engine and removing the junk attached to the camshaft. You see, I really need to get this engine to idle a lot lower, and this is the only way I can adjust the idle down. Let's see what happens if we crank the engine with the ignition off. Yep, it's having problems. Alright, let's try it again with the ignition on. So yeah, the engine does have a tough time cranking over if it's on its compression stroke. But once the engine starts spinning, the starter seems fine. This sort of reminds me of my dad's 1967 Impala with a 327 on a hot day. Well, sort of. Things were a lot different back then. Anyway, what do you folks think? Should we take this experiment to the next step? Let me know in the comments. I would like to give a huge thank you to all the new patrons that signed up recently, and of course to everyone else who subscribed to this channel. If you want to see us do performance testing on this Renault in the next episode, well, consider subscribing if you haven't done so already. That way, YouTube will keep you informed when we drop a new video. Anyway, I had fun and I hope you did too. We'll see you next time. Until then.